The 1970s handed Hollywood some of its most celebrated masterpieces, but for every Godfather, there was a spectacular financial disaster that studios prayed you would forget. Some cost more than entire film slates, others destroyed careers overnight. A few were so reviled that directors publicly apologized. These 18 films crashed harder than anyone expected, and their stories are wilder than fiction. Number 18, March or Die, 1977. Gene Hackman leading a French Foreign Legion epic sounded like box office gold on paper. Director Dick Richards had just delivered the sleeper hit Farewell My Lovely, and Columbia Pictures believed they had a desert adventure that could rival Lawrence of Arabia. They were catastrophically wrong. The production was plagued from the start with sandstorms destroying sets in Morocco and tensions between cast members reaching boiling points. Hackman reportedly clashed with Richards over the film's tone, wanting grittier realism while the director pushed for romantic adventure. Terence Hill, fresh from his Italian Western fame, seemed miscast as a brooding legionnaire, and critics noticed the awkward chemistry immediately. Columbia spent around $15 million on lavish desert sequences and period costumes, expecting a return that never materialized. The film earned roughly $3 million domestically, making it one of the year's quietest disasters. Reviews were savage, with Variety calling it handsomely mounted but dramatically inert. Roger Ebert gave it 1 star and questioned why such talented actors looked so bored. The failure effectively ended Dick Richards' brief moment as a studio filmmaker. He would struggle to find major projects afterward. Hackman rarely discussed the film in interviews, and it became one of those expensive mistakes that vanished from public memory almost immediately after release. Number 17, A Matter of Time, 1976. Vincente Minnelli directing his own daughter Liza in a romantic fantasy should have been a beautiful Hollywood moment. Instead, it became one of cinema's saddest family tragedies, a legendary director's final film, butchered beyond recognition. Minnelli had crafted some of Hollywood's greatest musicals, from Meet Me in St. Louis to Gigi. Now 73 years old and in declining health, he poured everything into this story of a chambermaid transformed by an eccentric countess. Ingrid Bergman signed on for the countess role, creating a dream casting that attracted significant attention. Then, American International Pictures intervened. The studio re-edited Minnelli's cut without his consent, adding a framing device and removing nearly an hour of footage. The released version made little narrative sense, with scenes jarring against each other without proper transitions. Minnelli was devastated and publicly disowned the theatrical release. The film earned barely over $1 million against its budget, disappearing from theaters within weeks. Critics blamed the incoherent editing rather than the performances, with several noting Bergman brought dignity to impossible material. Liza Minnelli fought for years to restore her father's vision, calling the theatrical cut an abomination. Vincente Minnelli never directed again. He died in 1986, still hoping someone would release his original version. It remains one of old Hollywood's cruelest endings, a master's final canvas destroyed by studio interference. At number 16, Quintet, 1979. Robert Altman was untouchable after Nashville cemented his reputation as American cinema's great maverick. So when he pitched a post-apocalyptic Ice Age thriller starring Paul Newman, 20th Century Fox wrote the checks. They had no idea what Altman would actually deliver. Shot entirely in the abandoned remains of Montreal's Expo 67, the film imagined a frozen future where survivors play a deadly board game. Altman deliberately smeared Vaseline on camera lenses to create a dreamlike haze, a technique that made audiences physically uncomfortable and critics openly hostile. Newman wandered through bleak, frozen landscapes speaking cryptic dialogue about death and fate. Supporting actors, including Bibi Andersson and Fernando Rey, seemed equally confused by the material. Altman refused to explain the mythology behind the titular game, believing ambiguity enhanced the existential themes. Fox executives watched early cuts in horror. The studio had expected a commercial science fiction adventure and received an art house meditation that tested audience patience. Marketing the film proved nearly impossible since explaining the plot required explaining Altman's philosophical intentions. Opening weekend returns were disastrous, and theaters pulled the film quickly. Reviews ranged from confused to outright angry. Even Altman's defenders struggled to champion this one. Newman called working on it an interesting experience in interviews, which Hollywood insiders recognized as diplomatic code for something much less flattering. Number 15. The Day of the Locust, 1975. Nathaniel West's savage novel about Hollywood's dark underbelly seemed impossible to adapt. Director John Schlesinger, riding high after Midnight Cowboy and Marathon Man, believed he could capture West's bitter portrait of Depression-era dreamers crushed by the studio system. The film featured Karen Black as a talentless actress, Donald Sutherland as her pathetic admirer, and William Atherton as an artist corrupted by Hollywood's emptiness. Schlesinger staged an apocalyptic premiere sequence where a crowd riots, trampling and killing in pursuit of celebrity. The imagery was intentionally disturbing and uncomfortably relevant. Paramount invested heavily, expecting prestige and possibly Oscar attention. They received a nihilistic nightmare that audiences actively avoided. The film's relentless bleakness offered no heroes to root for, no redemption arcs, no comfort whatsoever. American audiences rejected it completely. Critics were divided, some praising Schlesinger's ambition, while others found the result pretentious and punishing. Roger Ebert admired individual sequences but questioned whether the film added up to anything meaningful. Box office returns were catastrophic, and Paramount buried it quickly. The Day of the Locust has since been reassessed as a prophetic examination of celebrity obsession and American disillusionment. But in 1975, nobody wanted Schlesinger's bitter medicine. The failure taught studios that literary prestige does not guarantee commercial success, especially when the source material hates everything Hollywood represents. Number 14, Mame, 1974. Lucille Ball was American television royalty. When Warner Brothers announced she would star in the film adaptation of the Broadway smash Mame, anticipation was enormous. The resulting disaster nearly destroyed Ball's film career permanently. Ball was 63, playing a role written for someone decades younger. Director Gene Saks struggled to work around her limitations, reportedly using extensive dubbing and creative editing to mask vocal problems. Ball insisted on doing her own singing despite protests from the production team. The finished film felt like a museum piece, a creaky artifact that ignored the cultural revolution happening in American cinema. While Coppola and Scorsese were reinventing the medium, Mame offered old-fashioned musical numbers performed without irony or energy. Critics savaged it mercilessly. Ball's singing voice became the primary target. Reviewers described it as painful, embarrassing, and evidence that studios had prioritized star power over artistic common sense. The Golden Globe nomination Ball received was seen as a sympathy gesture rather than genuine recognition. Warner Brothers lost approximately $15 million, a staggering sum that contributed to the studio's mid-70s financial crisis. Ball retreated to television and rarely discussed the film afterward. The Mame failure proved that even beloved television icons cannot automatically transfer their appeal to the big screen, especially when the material demands skills they simply do not possess. Number 13, Lost Horizon, 1973. Remaking a beloved classic as a musical requires either genius or insanity. Producer Ross Hunter chose insanity, turning Frank Capra's 1937 fantasy into a bloated musical extravaganza that became synonymous with Hollywood excess. Peter Finch played the diplomat who discovers the mystical Shangri-La, but the star power extended everywhere. Liv Ullmann, Sally Kellerman, George Kennedy, Michael York, and Charles Boyer all wandered through expensive sets singing forgettable Burt Bacharach songs. The cast seemed embarrassed, and critics noticed. Columbia Pictures spent $12 million on the production, an astronomical budget that demanded massive returns. The studio received a catastrophic $5 million in domestic grosses, making Lost Horizon one of the decade's most spectacular write-offs. Reviews were apocalyptic. Critics competed to craft the most devastating insults, with one famous review suggesting the film should be shown to prisoners as punishment. The musical sequences stopped narrative momentum dead, and Bacharach's contemporary pop style clashed violently with the mystical setting. Ross Hunter never produced another major studio film. The failure effectively ended the classical Hollywood musical's already fading viability. Younger audiences saw Lost Horizon as proof that old Hollywood had completely lost touch with reality. Decades later, the film developed a small cult following among bad movie enthusiasts who appreciate its sincere awfulness. But in 1973, it represented everything wrong with studio thinking, an expensive mistake built on nostalgia nobody actually wanted. Number 12, Meteor, 1979. The disaster film craze had minted fortunes throughout the 70s. Earthquake, Towering Inferno, and Poseidon Adventure proved audiences loved watching famous people die spectacularly. So, American International Pictures gathered Sean Connery, Natalie Wood, Carl Malden, and Henry Fonda to save Earth from a giant asteroid. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. The special effects looked cheap even by 1979 standards, with obvious matte lines and unconvincing miniature destruction. Connery sleepwalked through scenes requiring him to explain scientific concepts he clearly did not understand or care about. The Soviet cooperation subplot felt like desperate padding to stretch a thin premise. AIP spent around $16 million expecting blockbuster returns. They earned roughly $9 million domestically, a disappointing figure that failed to cover production and marketing costs. Foreign returns helped reduce losses, but the film was universally recognized as a failure. Critics attacked the ridiculous dialogue, the wooden performances, and the laughable effects. One reviewer noted that the meteor threatening Earth generated more sympathy than any human character. Connery later admitted he took the role purely for financial reasons during a difficult period in his career. Meteor effectively killed the disaster film cycle that had dominated mid-70s programming. Audiences had grown tired of the formula, and this cheap imitation confirmed the genre's creative bankruptcy. The film became a punchline, referenced whenever critics discussed Hollywood's tendency to chase trends until they collapsed completely. Number 11. Hurricane, 1979. Dino De Laurentiis believed he could recreate the magic of the 1937 John Ford disaster film with modern special effects and star power. He hired Jan Troell to direct, cast Jason Robards and Mia Farrow, and built elaborate sets in Bora Bora. The ambition was enormous. The result was forgettable. The storm sequences cost fortunes to stage, involving massive water tanks, wind machines, and dangerous practical effects. Several crew members were injured during production, and the physical demands pushed everyone to exhaustion. De Laurentiis expected the spectacle would justify every dollar. Audiences disagreed. The romantic story between the leads generated zero chemistry, and the characters were too thin to generate emotional investment before the hurricane arrived. Critics complained that the film took forever to reach its advertised disaster, then delivered effects that failed to justify the wait. Paramount distributed the film and watched it disappear quickly. The $22 million budget returned roughly $5 million domestically, requiring substantial foreign revenue just to approach break-even. Reviews mentioned the beautiful Polynesian scenery, but little else worth praising. Mia Farrow's casting was particularly controversial, with critics questioning her suitability for a Polynesian character. The film's racial politics felt antiquated even then, adding another layer of discomfort to an already troubled production. Hurricane proved that disaster films required more than expensive destruction. Without characters worth saving, all the wind and water in the world meant nothing. Number 10. Lucky Lady, 1975. Gene Hackman, Liza Minnelli, and Burt Reynolds as Prohibition-era smugglers sounded irresistible. Stanley Donen, who had directed Singin' in the Rain, seemed like the perfect choice for a lighthearted adventure comedy. 20th Century Fox bet enormous money that star power and pedigree would guarantee success. The production was troubled from day one. Reynolds and Hackman reportedly did not get along, and the romantic triangle between the three leads never found proper balance. Donen struggled to maintain consistent tone, veering between screwball comedy, violent action, and sentimental romance without mastering any single mode. Fox spent around $13 million and subjected the film to extensive reshoots after disastrous test screenings. Multiple endings were filmed as executives desperately sought something that worked. Nothing did. Critics demolished Lucky Lady with unusual venom. Reviews called it smug, charmless, and a waste of considerable talent. The attempted quirkiness felt forced rather than organic, and audiences sensed the calculation behind every moment. Box office returns were catastrophic. The film earned roughly $12 million against its inflated budget, losing money once marketing and distribution were factored. The failure embarrassed everyone involved, particularly Reynolds, who was supposed to be ascending to major stardom. Donen's career never fully recovered. He would direct only a handful of additional features, none approaching his classic work. Lucky Lady became a cautionary tale about assuming star combinations would automatically generate chemistry. Number 9. Exorcist II, The Heretic, 1977. The original Exorcist became the highest-grossing horror film ever, a cultural phenomenon that terrified millions. Warner Brothers demanded a sequel immediately, eventually hiring visionary director John Boorman to deliver something nobody expected or wanted. Boorman had no interest in repeating the original's straightforward horror. Instead, he crafted a metaphysical exploration involving African locusts, psychic research, and Richard Burton hunting demons across multiple continents. Linda Blair returned as Reagan, now a teenager grappling with her traumatic past, but the film ignored everything that made audiences connect with her originally. Production problems multiplied. Boorman's ambitious vision required extensive special effects that the budget could not properly support. Burton showed up visibly exhausted, delivering dialogue about ancient evil with minimal conviction. Test screenings were disasters, with audiences laughing at moments intended to terrify. The opening weekend broke records for the franchise before word of mouth destroyed it. By the second weekend, returns had collapsed as audiences warned each other to stay away. Critics were merciless, calling it pretentious nonsense and an insult to the original. Warner Brothers panicked, re-editing the film multiple times in a futile attempt to salvage something watchable. Nothing worked. The sequel earned roughly $30 million against its $14 million budget. Technically profitable, but far below expectations. Exorcist II became legendary as one of the worst sequels ever made. Boorman defended his artistic intentions for years, but audiences and critics never forgave the squandered potential. Number 8. The Great Gatsby, 1974. F. Scott Fitzgerald's masterpiece had defeated previous film adaptations. Paramount believed that Robert Redford, Mia Farrow, and a Francis Ford Coppola screenplay could finally crack the code. They assembled the most expensive literary adaptation in history and delivered a beautiful corpse. Director Jack Clayton created visually stunning recreations of Jazz-age excess. Costumes by Theoni V. Aldridge were so impressive they won the Oscar. Every frame looked like a museum exhibit, but the emotional core that makes Fitzgerald's novel immortal never translated to the screen. Redford's Gatsby was handsome but hollow, lacking the desperate romantic hunger that defines the character. Farrow's Daisy seemed vapid without the tragic dimension Fitzgerald intended. Critics complained that the film substituted opulence for insight, confusing pretty pictures for meaningful storytelling. The $6 million budget required massive returns that never materialized. Opening weekend was strong, thanks to star power and literary prestige, but word of mouth killed momentum. The film earned roughly $20 million, disappointing against expectations and marketing investment. Reviews acknowledged the technical achievements while savaging the emotional vacuum at the center. Pauline Kael wrote one of her most devastating critiques, arguing that the filmmakers had embalmed rather than adapted the source material. Coppola distanced himself from the final product, claiming his screenplay had been significantly altered. The failure proved that literary greatness does not automatically produce cinematic greatness, especially when reverence replaces interpretation. Number 7. Darling Lily, 1970. Blake Edwards was flying high after the Pink Panther films made him Hollywood's comedy king. When he proposed a World War I musical spy thriller starring his wife Julie Andrews, Paramount approved a massive budget expecting another Mary Poppins-scale success. They received a bloated vanity project that nearly bankrupted the studio. Production dragged for over 2 years as Edwards demanded perfection on elaborate aerial sequences and period recreations. The budget ballooned from $11 million to approximately $25 million, astronomical for 1970. Studio executives grew increasingly alarmed as costs multiplied without end in sight. Andrews played a German spy seducing an American pilot played by Rock Hudson. The tonal mixture never cohered, shifting awkwardly between light-hearted romance, wartime drama, and musical spectacle. Edwards seemed uncertain what film he was actually making, and the confusion showed in every scene. Critics attacked the film's self-indulgence and excessive length. The original cut ran over 3 hours before Paramount demanded substantial editing. Even the shortened version tested audience patience with pacing that crawled when it should have soared. Box office returns were disastrous, earning roughly $15 million against the inflated budget. Paramount's financial statements for 1970 cited Darling Lily as a primary reason for annual losses. Edwards was effectively exiled from major studio filmmaking for several years. The film became a textbook example of directorial ego unchecked by studio discipline, proof that even talented filmmakers can lose perspective when given unlimited resources. Number 6. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1978. Robert Stigwood had produced Saturday Night Fever and Grease, two of the decade's biggest musical hits. His confidence was understandable when he announced a film based entirely on Beatles songs featuring Peter Frampton and the Bee Gees. His confidence was also catastrophically misplaced. The concept was absurd from conception. A fantasy narrative would connect Beatles songs performed by artists without a fraction of the original's charisma or vocal distinctiveness. Frampton and the Gibbs brothers were popular recording artists, but wooden screen presences who could not carry a film. Universal Pictures invested approximately $13 million on elaborate musical sequences that felt like extended music videos without the brevity that format requires. George Burns appeared as a narrator, seemingly bewildered by the surrounding chaos. Steve Martin showed up for a musical cameo that became more embarrassing as his star rose. Reviews were apocalyptic. Critics called it a desecration of beloved music, an ego trip that proved money could not purchase artistic legitimacy. The film earned roughly $20 million worldwide, barely covering costs when marketing was factored. The Bee Gees' film careers ended immediately. Frampton retreated to touring and never attempted another acting role. The soundtrack sold reasonably well, but album success could not redeem the cinematic disaster. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band proved that beloved music does not automatically translate to compelling cinema, especially when the performers cannot match the original's genius. Number 5. The Wiz, 1978. Motown Productions believed they could transform the Tony Award-winning Broadway musical into a blockbuster that would launch their film division. They hired Sidney Lumet, cast Diana Ross as Dorothy despite her being 33 years old, and spent over $24 million on elaborate New York City fantasy sequences. The casting of Ross was controversial immediately. The Broadway production had featured young Stephanie Mills, and audiences struggled to accept a middle-aged woman playing a childlike innocent. Ross delivered committed work, but the fundamental miscasting undermined everything built around her performance. Michael Jackson's film debut as the Scarecrow generated the only genuine excitement. His natural screen presence suggested stardom that would soon explode beyond anyone's imagination, but one supporting performance could not save a troubled production. Lumet staged ambitious musical numbers throughout New York landmarks, transformed into Oz equivalents. The Emerald City became the World Trade Center Plaza. The production design was genuinely impressive, earning the sole Oscar nomination the film received. Universal distributed the film expecting crossover success that never materialized. The $24 million budget returned approximately $13 million domestically, a substantial loss that embarrassed everyone involved. Black audiences, who should have been the core demographic, rejected it as patronizing. Critics praised isolated elements while questioning the entire conception. The Wiz proved that good intentions and expensive production values cannot compensate for fundamental creative misjudgments. At number 4, 1941-1979, Steven Spielberg was the most successful director alive after Jaws and Close Encounters. Universal and Columbia co-financed his ambitious World War II comedy, giving him essentially unlimited resources and creative freedom. The resulting film taught Hollywood that even geniuses make mistakes. The premise involved Japanese submarine panic along the California coast following Pearl Harbor. Spielberg assembled an enormous cast including John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, Ned Beatty, Christopher Lee, and dozens more recognizable faces. Every scene featured elaborate destruction, military hardware, and chaotic physical comedy staged at deafening volume. The $35 million budget was staggering for 1979, especially for a comedy. Spielberg built elaborate sets only to destroy them spectacularly, staging action sequences that prioritized scale over coherence. The film ran nearly 2 hours and 20 minutes, exhausting viewers before the halfway point. Critics recognized the technical skill while questioning the artistic judgment. Reviews used words like bloated, excessive, and numbing. Audiences expecting another Spielberg triumph found themselves assaulted by noise without wit. Box office returns were disappointing, earning roughly $90 million worldwide against the massive budget and expectations. While technically profitable, the film was considered a failure given Spielberg's track record and the resources invested. Spielberg later acknowledged making mistakes, admitting he had prioritized spectacle over story and character. The experience taught him discipline that would serve Raiders of the Lost Ark well. Sometimes failure provides the most valuable education. Number 3. New York, 1977. Martin Scorsese had just completed Taxi Driver, one of the most acclaimed and disturbing films of the decade. He immediately pivoted to a romantic musical starring Robert De Niro and Liza Minnelli, believing he could reinvent a classical Hollywood genre through his personal artistic vision. United Artists provided substantial financing, trusting Scorsese's reputation and the commercial appeal of his stars. Production became legendary for excess, with Scorsese shooting hundreds of hours of footage while struggling with personal demons that would later force him into rehabilitation. De Niro played a jazz saxophonist whose relationship with a singer, played by Minnelli, mirrors the tortured dynamic between art and commerce. The film deliberately evoked Golden Age musicals while subverting their romantic conventions. Happy endings were not Scorsese's style. Critics were deeply divided. Some praised the ambitious deconstruction of genre expectations, while others found the result pretentious and punishing. The nearly 3-hour running time tested everyone's patience, and the downbeat conclusion left audiences unsatisfied. United Artists lost approximately $15 million, a devastating blow during a difficult period for the studio. The failure contributed to financial pressures that would eventually lead to the Heaven's Gate catastrophe and UA's collapse. Scorsese retreated from Hollywood ambition, eventually making the documentary The Last Waltz before his career-defining 80s work. New York has been reassessed more favorably over time, but in 1977 it represented a significant stumble. Number 2, At Long Last Love, 1975. Peter Bogdanovich had directed 3 consecutive masterpieces in Targets, The Last Picture Show, and Paper Moon. Critics called him the new Orson Welles, a wunderkind who could do no wrong. Then he made a Cole Porter musical that destroyed his reputation overnight. The concept seemed charming enough. 4 wealthy characters would sing classic Porter songs while pursuing romantic entanglements in 1930s Manhattan. Bogdanovich cast his girlfriend Sybil Shepherd alongside Burt Reynolds, Madeline Kahn, and Duilio del Prete. He insisted all singing would be performed live rather than dubbed. The live singing decision proved catastrophic. None of the leads possessed adequate vocal ability, and the resulting performances ranged from embarrassing to painful. Reynolds later called the film the worst mistake of my career. Shepherd's thin voice became the primary target of critical mockery. 20th Century Fox had invested approximately $8 million expecting sophisticated entertainment for adult audiences. They received a vanity project that critics destroyed with unprecedented venom. Reviews called it unreleasable, tone-deaf, and career suicide. The film earned barely $2 million, one of the decade's most spectacular failures relative to budget and expectations. Bogdanovich's Hollywood standing collapsed immediately. Studios that had courted him suddenly refused his calls. At Long Last Love became shorthand for directorial hubris, proof that critical acclaim could vanish instantly when filmmakers believed their own mythology. Bogdanovich spent decades recovering from the damage. Number 1, Sorcerer, 1977. William Friedkin had directed The French Connection and The Exorcist, 2 of the most successful and acclaimed films of the early 70s. When he announced a remake of Henri-Georges Clouzot's Wages of Fear, expectations were enormous. Universal and Paramount co-financed a $22 million production that became one of cinema's greatest misunderstood disasters. Friedkin shot in multiple dangerous locations, including Dominican Republic jungles, New Mexican deserts, and Parisian slums. The production endured hurricanes, mudslides, equipment failures, and injuries that transformed a challenging shoot into an endurance test. The bridge crossing sequence alone took months to complete. Roy Scheider led a cast of international character actors playing desperate criminals hired to transport volatile explosives across impossible terrain. Friedkin created unbearable tension through practical effects and genuine danger, pushing his crew to physical limits. The finished film was a masterpiece of visceral filmmaking. Critics recognized its technical achievements while audiences stayed home completely. Opening the same month as Star Wars was catastrophic timing, but the film would likely have struggled regardless, given its nihilistic worldview and deliberate pacing. Sorcerer earned barely $9 million against its massive budget, one of the most devastating losses either studio had experienced. Friedkin's career never recovered the momentum he once enjoyed. He spent years defending the film against indifference. Decades later, Sorcerer is widely recognized as one of the 70s great achievements, a film destroyed by circumstances rather than quality. Its failure marked the end of director-driven New Hollywood and the beginning of blockbuster-dominated cinema. The 70s taught Hollywood that ambition without audience connection means nothing. These 18 films collectively lost hundreds of millions while destroying careers and reshaping industry priorities. Some deserved their failures. Others were masterpieces murdered by timing and marketing. And which bomb on this list do you think deserves reconsideration? Which ones remain genuinely terrible? Drop your controversial take in the comments and tell me this: should studios have trusted these visionary directors more, or did their failures prove the money people were right all along?